Man, cheers for coming on today. How are you? You okay? Yeah, I'm alright, thanks. Basically, now's your chance to sort of introduce yourself for anyone that doesn't know who or what you're about, and
Well, I
yeah,
think that
go
there will
from
be a
there.
lot of people.
Yeah.
There'll be quite a few people because I'm not exactly the most famous person in the world. My name is Mick West, and I run the website metabunk.org, and this is a site for discussing and debunking conspiracy theories. Basically, we try to find things that are wrong in the evidence that supports various conspiracy theories, and then we try to go into detail on those things. And we cover a variety of things, but we kind of specialize in the chemtrails conspiracy theory. We also cover 9/11 and various other things like UFOs and whatnot, and we even get into the flat Earth discussion sometimes.
I saw you just debating a guy on UFOs earlier on Twitter. What was going on there?
Well, there's a thing in America where the government has just kind of acknowledged the existence of a UFO study program that was run a few years ago. And the guys who used to be on that have kind of come out of the woodwork and they've got hired by some former pop star. The guy who was the frontman for Blink 182 started a company and they're trying to promote all this UFO stuff. And so there's a lot of talk about UFOs at the moment. So I've just been debating the various bits of evidence there.
So yeah, we've obviously been debating slightly on well, not slightly. We've been debating quite a lot on 9/11, going back and forth on certain
Yeah.
stances, and me sending you tweets and you replying, etc., etc. I kind of wanted your before obviously we go into sort of a debate and debunking certain things. What was your take on what happened on that day? Are you with the mainstream media story, or did you find it a little
Well,
bit iffy?
I think what we saw is what happened. That I think the planes hit the buildings were on fire, and then the buildings collapsed. I think those. I mean, most people agree with those basic facts that planes hit the buildings and the buildings were on fire and the buildings collapsed. I then think that the buildings collapsed because of the fires and the impact. And I think that the planes that hit the buildings were the actual planes that were hijacked, and the hijackers were Middle Eastern terrorists, essentially. Beyond that, I think probably the broad strokes of the official story are probably correct about who's behind it, but some of the details may not be entirely exactly as they put it.
Do you not think like because I know Bin Laden was the sort of main um, the guy that everyone wanted, but he was never, from what I've sort of read and looked into, never wanted by the FBI because there wasn't enough evidence linking him to the 9/11 attacks.
Yeah, I think that was just kind of more of a technicality than anything. Like he wasn't formally accused of the crime, but he was number one on the most wanted list. So it wasn't as if they didn't want him. It's just he wasn't officially charged with a specific crime yet because everybody knew what he had done. It was a bit beyond accusing people with crimes. It was essentially an act of war, and that's why they were trying to get him. So I don't think that's kind of a almost like
A twist on
overly
words, maybe.
technical.
Yeah.
Yeah.
No, that makes sense to me. I mean, these are things like people can read sort of on the internet and then be like, well, if Bin Laden didn't do it, like if Bin Laden wasn't wanted by the FBI, then he obviously must not have done it. So, yeah, and then they start going down the rabbit hole and looking into more information, and you're just kind of thinking, well, hold on a minute, maybe the words have been twisted slightly by the person that's blogging it or writing it on their website
Exactly.
rather than the
Exactly.
official
And
statement.
there's similar things like that in other conspiracy theories, like with the Sandy Hook conspiracy theory. People point out that the deaths at Sandy Hook were not listed on. I can't remember which one it is, but like one of the FBI reports for crimes in that year, they don't list the Sandy Hook deaths. And so they say, oh, they're not listed, therefore the entire thing must have been a hoax.
Mm.
But if you look into it, they're actually listed in another report, and they give a footnote in the first report saying for Sandy Hook, look at this. So it's actually all there, but it's very easy for people to just point to a simple fact, saying, oh, look at this line item here, there aren't enough deaths. and then extrapolate from that without bothering to do actually do any work. People like to glom on to very simple things and use them as evidence when the reality is a bit more complicated.
Yeah, I mean, the only the issue with the Sandy Hook thing, the only thing I found sort of strange was there was like obviously the police tapes were released of them like when they're in the building and going around for him and whatever, and there's like a whisper from one of the cops that says like "end the life of Adam," like that. It's like, and then obviously
Yeah,
they shoot him and that's it. And I'm kind of thinking, if you're maybe a conspiracy guy, you think, oh, that's a little bit weird. Why did they need to do that? Surely they'd just be like, there he is, shoot him. Do you know what I mean?
yeah, and I think that's one of those. You hear what you want to hear in things like that, and it's not just that you hear what you want to hear. You hear what you've been told you're going to hear. There's a famous video on YouTube. Well, it's not particularly famous, but it's just to me, it's just songs of praise. I don't know if you've ever seen songs of praise on TV. It's a Sunday show and they go singing in a church,
Yeah.
and it's the songs of praise with subtitles, and the subtitles are all changed, so it sounds like you read the subtitles and it really sounds like they're saying these things. It's a common trick that people do. You put subtitles on something, and especially with things that are a bit indistinct, if you've got subtitles, it sounds to you like they're actually saying that thing, even though they're not. They're saying something else. Like I don't know what it was actually. We looked into that one years ago, the end of life of Adam thing, and there's a variety of other suggestions for what the copper might have been saying. But end the life of Adam doesn't even make any sense.
No, it's true. I mean,
Cops aren't going to go and say end the life of Adam. It's like some kind of weird thing you'd see on a cartoon, like from Castle Grayskull or something like that. It just makes no sense.
Yeah, I mean, going sort of back to the 9/11 thing. Obviously, you said about like I tweeted you saying I don't feel that maybe the planes could have ripped through the steel structure at that speed, and also
Right.
about the pilots, John Lear being one of them, went on camera to say like he took himself and other people into a simulator and none of them could reenact hitting the middle of those towers.
Yeah.
And I sort of wanted to know your take on how that happened. Did they just get lucky, at those speeds? Because apparently, like the G-force as well, going at that speed, even if they turned the handle slightly to go in at the angle they did, it would have been horrendous. So.
Well, not really, because the G forces are the same in the upper air as they are in the lower air, and you can do fairly, pilots do standard rate turns, which are turns where it takes 2 minutes to go in a circle, and you don't need much more than that rate of turn to make adjustments when you're coming up on something as big as the World Trade Center. All they had to do was keep it in the middle of the windscreen of the plane, and they just turn to the left, turn to the right, very small adjustments, and then they just keep full throttle towards the end, and they just got to keep going. Now, the planes aren't designed to go that fast at that low altitude, and it would be very bad for the airframe, and it might even get very bumpy and difficult to control. But the thing about the plane is that it's going very fast in that direction. It takes a little bit for it to go to one side or the other. So even though the controls don't work very well, once you've got lined up, you don't really need very much to keep it lined up. It's like if you're going very, very fast in a truck down a road, it takes quite a bit to actually make it. Might not be the best example because trucks would go off the road, but with a plane, it's got a lot of inertia to keep it going forward. And it's not like a jet fighter where it can kind of go zoop, zoop, zoop from one side to the other. So I don't think it was particularly hard to fly into the towers. I tried it myself in flight simulators. I don't have a very good flight simulator. I actually just downloaded one the other night, but it's not that hard to, even when you're going very, very fast and a fairly accurate representation, you can fly into the towers. And then the other thing about the hole, we kind of discussed that on Twitter, but things that are going very, very fast can actually punch through things that are stronger than they are. There's a classic example of the ping pong ball going through a ping pong paddle, like a table tennis ball going through a table tennis paddle. If it's going fast enough, it'll just punch straight through it. It has to be going pretty fast, like 500 to 1,000 miles an hour. But a ping pong table tennis paddle is a lot stronger than a ping pong ball, and yet if it's going fast enough, it will go through it.
Yeah, I mean, the problem I had with sort of that answer is obviously we can, I could say, oh yeah, the different materials, so different outcomes, steel stronger than wood and whatever. So I'll scrap all of that
Right.
part. But the plane, like going at that speed at that altitude, they're so. I saw like a test being done on because obviously like engineers when the planes are being built they put them through like rigorous testing at speeds, and the plane that was in there going at that speed when they tested it, like the parts started to rip away, if that makes sense. So like the
Hmm.
speed it was going to, like the wings started to come back, little bits started to come off. The front of the nose, I'm really bad with remembering all the parts of a plane, but the front of the nose has like a sheet sort of on top of it that would peel off,
Yeah.
and so that led to me to thinking, oh well, those planes when they're coming in at that speed, it couldn't happen because the bits of the plane would be ripping off as it's going that quick, sort of into those towers.
Yeah, well, I'd be interested to know what that test was because it doesn't seem very likely that exceeding the speed by a significant amount is going to make the nose rip off a plane. The things have a margin of safety that's quite large. If it was trying to do maneuvers at a low altitude at a very high speed, then that would probably be a problem. But just flying along shouldn't be a problem, even at that high speed. Planes, that it was obviously operating right at the edge of its capabilities, but they weren't trying to do anything other than fly into a building. So even if bits were falling off it, it wouldn't have mattered. But as we saw, like things didn't actually fall off.
Yeah, I mean, obviously we said about like the nose as well when it went into the tower. Obviously, I linked you that video and a few other videos,
Right.
which your reply was your reply. And obviously, a guy called Ace Baker, I don't know how well trusted he is, so I'm not going to say, take it like gospel truth, but he basically had cut the nose of the plane before it had entered and lined it up with
Hmm.
the image that you could see coming out, and they were
Yeah, I've
like
seen that.
identical. So I was thinking to myself, well, how is that possible? Obviously, if it's punching through. And then what
Right.
added more to the conspiracy on that side of things was later on the mainstream media used like big Fox News banners and stuff to cover up sort of the nose end coming out, and I was thinking, well, why have they covered it up if it's nothing to worry about?
Well, what you're seeing coming out is just basically the explosion on the other side, and you can actually see this if you look at all of the footage of the plane hitting the second tower. There's quite a bit of it. There's quite a few different camera angles and some photographs, and you can see the shape of basically it's the leading edge of the fireball coming out the other side, and it's kind of in 3D, so you got to imagine it looking at it from the other side. But what you're seeing there, it's I hate to like appeal to coincidences, but this one really was a coincidence. It just happened to look similar to the nose of the plane on the other side. And if you actually take them side by side, there's not a lot there. There's it's like a little lump with a bit sticking out. So there's like the nose and then the cockpit shape, and it doesn't take very much to get something that looks similar to that. So I think that that's just a coincidence. It's just the explosion on the other side, and it. I'd really don't understand what would be how would that even work? When you say the nose came out of the other side, what do people think is actually going on there? Do they think it actually went through the entire building without getting damaged and then turned to smoke, or are people suggesting that the video itself was faked?
Yeah, I mean, obviously, I've watched many different conspiracy theories on it, going from no planes to energy weapons to thermite. So,
Right.
I like to entertain all of them and then kind of form my own conclusion on that. And I think
Hmm.
for that one, what people are suggesting in that conspiracy theory is that the video that was shown there was like a CGI video of the plane coming in, and what they'd done is they'd like fucked it up basically, and they hadn't edited. Um,
Right.
I can't remember what it is. It's like the split down the screen, and they'd got it off center slightly, so it didn't
Yeah.
cover
Yeah.
that bit of the nose. I'm not.
So they think that. Well, the obvious problem with the no plane theory is that New York has, like 6 million people in it, and a very large percentage of those people were watching on that day. So if you've got tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of people looking up at the Twin Towers, and they're seeing what happened, and then if later you're going to show them a video that looks different to what actually happened, it's just not going to work. There's no way you could possibly take video. There was lots of independent individual people who were taking video of the plane, of the towers, and some of those videos show the second plane hitting. So the idea that the broadcast TV coverage was faked just doesn't stand up to any scrutiny, because it's literally impossible for it to be fake and to convince hundreds of thousands of people plus the people who were there taking their own video. It just wouldn't work.
Yeah, I mean that's always been my sort of issue with the no plane theory, is that there have been people that have come out and obviously said, yeah, we saw the plane going in, and it come down and it hit and we've got it on video and etc. etc. So for that you have to believe like a lot of people are in on the conspiracy, and obviously,
and then
go on, you carry on.
Sorry, that it's like you see the plane-shaped hole, you see things like the engine coming out the other side and landing on the street. People will obviously continue to point to things that they find confusing, like why did it leave a nice neat hole like this, and why does this engine not look like a jet engine, things like that. But these things, if you look into them, they've all got reasonable explanations, and it's just, but people prefer to pick evidence that they think supports their own theory. They don't want to, if someone believes that there was no plane, then they're going to be very, very skeptical of the actual evidence.
Yeah, I mean, obviously with the engine flying out, I think this is like so bad bad on my part for not fully researching it, but the engine that they found on the street was apparently the wrong engine for the plane that hit the tower.
Yeah, it wasn't there. It wasn't. Like we did a whole bunch of research on that one and found like the exact type of engine, and we found some photos and video of the type of that engine being put together. And the way jet engines are built is they're kind of like essentially a series of tubes, one within the other. There's the central drive shaft, and then there's all the turbines and things that go around them, and then there's rings and things attached to those, and then something's attached to that, and then there's the external thing, and then there's the big fan that goes on the front, and then there's the big canopy that envelops the whole thing. So there's all these layers of the engine. So when people think of these jet engines, they think of these things that look like a small van size thing. But the core part of the engine is a lot smaller than that, and that's what you saw actually on the street. It was the middle bit of the engine, and it was actually the back part of the engine. It wasn't even the whole engine. It was like the middle bit of the back part of the engine. It was the turbine section, which is the thing that drives the drive shaft. So it was hard for people initially to link that crushed kind of weird looking thing on the ground to these big beautiful jet engines, because it was just this bit of the engine. It had been through a lot, obviously. It had gone through the building and probably hit a bunch of things on the way through, and most of it had been stripped away. But it did match, and you can look it up if you want. It's on Metadebunk, the Murray Street engine.
Yeah, I mean, also I'm sure probably people think, oh well, different planes, that must mean all like the engines are created differently for each different plane, and they're like totally different looking things. But I'm sure like even if you look at car engines, obviously they've got their similarities. They all have the same sort of structure, just the different logo on the front. So I'm sure that kind of applies to planes in a sense. Is like not each individual plane has a specific sort of engine.
Yeah, they do. Planes do generally have a couple of engines at least. Well, usually at least one, obviously, engine that will work with them. Quite often, it's interchangeable with different engines. But this engine, like it had, there was a specific part. I think it was called the Moby duct, which is just this part of the engine that they thought was looking wrong because they found two different pictures, one of this version and one of another one. But if you look into it, the pictures they were showing weren't pictures of the same thing. One was like the base of the thing, and the other was the thing that goes on top of it. But the details like that are a little hard for your average person to research because this is stuff you have to dig into, like Boeing maintenance manuals, which aren't generally freely available. So it's quite easy for people to make claims and say, this is the wrong part, when it actually was. It was the right part.
So obviously I sent you a couple of videos on Twitter about sort of the physics side of it, and that guy doing the experiments on the sort of the force behind the motion and how
Right.
it just fell with no deacceleration, and he showed like a little chart, and like the 15 towers wouldn't have been, the 15 stories or however many stories above wouldn't have been strong enough to blow out the ones below and then disintegrate itself. What's your sort of take on that and sort of explanation for that?
Well, I think he's not really looking at the way the towers actually collapsed. Like once the top part of the building started to fall, it was obviously no longer being supported by the lower part. Now, you kind of think of the towers as being like a series of floors, one stacked on top of the other, and one floor is supporting the floor above it, and that supports the floor above that. But that's not really the way it works. The building is really a series of columns with the floors attached to the columns. Everything is being supported by the columns. The floors themselves can hardly support anything. So when something falls on a floor, like something that is horizontal, it can really support very, very little weight. Since almost the entire weight of the building is carried by the columns, if those columns were to suddenly not be lined up with a column underneath, and instead being twisted over, and then they fall down this way, they're falling onto a floor. Now, the floor is only loosely, not loosely, it's very strongly, but relatively speaking, it's attached to the column. And when something falls on the floor, it gets stripped away from the column. And because there's so little force, relatively speaking, that's needed to actually remove the floors, once things start falling through the floors, there's just no way of stopping it. If things were falling on the columns themselves, then the argument would make sense. The building is supporting the building above. But once that's no longer lined up with the columns, that's completely irrelevant. The supporting force of the lower building is completely irrelevant because all it's falling through now is the floors. And once the floors get stripped away from the columns, then the columns lose all of their sideways support, and they become very vulnerable to slight sideways pressures. And the columns themselves, they were just kind of loosely welded together. They're very, very strong things, the core columns. I'm sure you've looked at them. Some of them are like 3-inch thick steel, 4-inch thick steel boxes. And they're these incredibly strong things. Obviously, can support thousands of tons. But they're basically just placed one on top of the other, and then they were just welded with a line weld along the seam on either side. They weren't even welded on the short ends. They were just welded along the long ends. And they weren't even welded like that, basically for alignment. They didn't actually anticipate any need for the columns to be strong from the side. And so what happened when the floors got stripped on one of the small sideways forces was able to snap those welds, and the columns fell down. You've probably seen in the pile these pristine-looking core columns, and you see the ends of them are just they're square, because they're just basically snapped off. Yeah, they've just been snapped off. They haven't. There's very few of the columns actually got twisted. There's the ones obviously are in the initial collapse area got mangled up, but once the building started to fall, things were basically just snapping off and falling as these straight things. It looks like a bunch of straight sticks lying on the ground.
Yeah, I mean, I was literally kind of answered my second bit anyways, because I was going to say to you, obviously, with the top of the columns doing what they did and then kind of landing and pushing the floors out, which would explain the explosions coming out the side because of the amount of pressure coming down.
Yeah.
But I was thinking, like, how did these steel columns like collapse from that high all the way down to the ground if the pressure that's meant to be pushing down to help them collapse is slanted off onto the floors instead?
Yeah, it's very interesting. If you look at, I think Tower 1 shows it best, but once all the floors have collapsed all the way down to the ground, excuse me, then half of the core of the building, the core column, is actually still there. And it stays there for quite a while longer, like about another 10, 15 seconds or so. And you see these core columns going nearly halfway up the side of the building, the interior of the building. And they take a while to collapse. They're not actually collapsing because things are falling on them from above. They're collapsing because all the floors have been stripped away from them. A lot of the horizontal beams between them have also been stripped away. And then when all the main collapse hits the ground, it has to spread out. When it hits the ground, it all falls down, spreads out, which means it puts pressure on the bottom of the columns, and they fail down there, somewhere down near the bottom, and then it kind of falls into itself, actually kind of a similar way to the way World Trade Center 7 collapsed, so that the core column actually collapses from the bottom down. The building, of course, collapses from the top down because it's just this boom, 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 all the way down. But then the core, the half of the core that's still remaining, collapses from the bottom down because it fails because of slender column buckling, which is when the things get stripped away. It doesn't have enough support from the sides, so snaps, falls down.
Yeah, I mean, with World Trade Center 7, I think they've just done, I can't remember the company, the university or whatever, but they've just proven...
Alaska.
Yeah, they've just proven that it didn't fall due to structure fire.
They claim that they proved that. Yeah, they claim that they proved that, but they haven't actually released their study yet. And they did release. It wasn't really very good. It was very confusing. Like they were comparing numbers, which didn't make any sense. Like he was saying, in the NIST report, the column moved this way relative to the column. The beam moved this way relative to the column. But in our simulation, everything moved 2 inches in the other direction, and so it wouldn't have failed. But it's very confusing because he's comparing the wrong things. It's like he's comparing global motion against local motion. And he doesn't really give any detail as to how he got these figures or what he did. So I'm waiting for the actual report to be released. They say they're going to release a draft report in February or March, and we'll look at that then. But there was a lot of problems with his initial presentation, so I really don't think they can say that they've proved it. They can say that that's what they think, but they really haven't proved it yet.
No, yeah, I mean, obviously my concern with World Trade Center 7 is that the BBC, obviously here in England, reported it 20 minutes or so before it actually collapsed, and no plane or anything went into the building. And obviously the conspiracy theory here is that like plane 93 that got shot down was meant to be the one that hit the Solomon Brothers World Trade Center 7 building. Obviously it got shot down, so they just collapsed the building sort of into its own footprint, without sort of the assistance of fire or anything like that. I mean, there was fire. There's got to have been, because I think in photos of the building beforehand, before it collapsed, you could see like scorch marks on the sides of the building.
Yeah, well, it's not just that it was scorch marks. There was raging fires going on. There was an entire floor that was completely involved in fire. Like if you have shots through the window, and it's just like it's an inferno in there. So it wasn't like it was just a few little fires. And if you look at the south side of the building, when you look at the famous video of the building falling, it just goes down behind this other building. You're looking at the north side. Now, the other side of the building, the south side, is the side that faced the World Trade Center towers. And just behind that, there would have been World Trade Center 1. And when World Trade Center 1 fell down, it actually broke most of the windows on the south side of the tower of the World Trade Center 7. It also gouged out a large chunk of the southwest corner. it's hard to tell because of all the smoke, but it looks like it actually took out one of the exterior columns in the middle of the south side of the building. And the building was basically on fire, since World Trade Center 1 collapsed, and a pretty big fire. Like this, if you look at the south side pictures, which I encourage you to do, you'll see these, smoke coming from the entire south side of the building. Now, it doesn't look like much if you just focus on one or two pictures from the north side, but there was a lot of fire there. It wasn't on every floor. It wasn't as big a fire as the World Trade Center 1 and 2 was, but it was a lot of fire, and it was fully involved, and it was.
Oh, you've broken up a little bit.
Sorry, am I back yet? Can you hear me now?
Yeah, I can hear you. Yeah.
All right. A terrible internet connection because I'm out in the country. Right. So the BBC they pre-announced that the building was going to fall, but people have been talking about it on the news about it collapsing for like over an hour before that as well, because the firemen had told people that they thought that it might collapse, and some of them had told them that they thought it was probably going to collapse, and the firemen they pulled back from World Trade Center 7 because they thought there was a danger of it collapsing. So they didn't fight the fires anymore, and eventually it did collapse. So the fact that they announced it ahead of time was really just kind of like, kind of a Chinese whispers type thing. They were told, we're told that Building 7 might collapse. What? Building 7's collapsed? Building 7's collapsed. Let's announce it. So, so that just goes from it's probably going to collapse to it has collapsed. Because they could be talking about World Trade Center 1 has collapsed. It has collapsed. Yeah. World Trade Center 7 it might collapse. And then it's a very understandable mistake for people to make in a chaotic news situation like that. If people had no idea what was going on, and they just, they didn't know what Building 7 was. No one had ever heard of Building 7 before that day.
Yeah.
So they was told that another building might collapse, and then that's just got mangled around. And the reporter there, she didn't announce it herself. She didn't know that it had collapsed. Obviously, it was there behind her. She was just reading what someone had told her, or what someone had passed her on a piece of paper.
Yeah, I mean that sort of makes sense as well, because they want to release news. BBC News, they all want to release a story first. They want to be first on the button. So if they get a whiff of something that could have potentially happened in a chaotic situation, they're more than likely going to release it, because then they're the first source on the case.
Yeah, and at that stage, nothing had happened for a while, so they'd just been talking over the same things for a couple of hours. Obviously, things were happening. It was the recovery and rescue efforts that they were trying to do, but nothing major had happened. You got these two huge events, and then all they could do is talk about those events. So I guess they kind of leapt at the chance to talk about some other event, another building collapsing.
So obviously, in the sense of like the fire taking down World Trade Center 7, we had over in the UK something called Grenfell Tower, which I don't know whether you would have heard of it over.
Yeah, no, it's pretty famous over here too.
And obviously it had like cladding all up the sides of the buildings, and the fire was, ridiculous, and but that like never collapsed due to fire, and on 9/11 you had obviously those three buildings collapsed due to. I mean, obviously you had the planes go into 1 and 2, but fundamentally those three buildings collapsed due to the fire.
Right.
And yet it hasn't happened since or before that I can find anyways. Maybe you've found something, because I know a lot of conspiracy theorists say, well, on that day 3 buildings fell due to fire, and it's never happened since and never happened before. What's going on?
Yeah, well, the big thing about it never happening before, we never had buildings being flown into by jet planes before. This is the first time that I think there was a block of flats in Holland that got flown into by a jet plane, but that pretty much collapsed as well. But we never had anything on this scale before, so it's not like there were just some fires randomly happening and then the buildings fell down. There was these very big events, the planes flying into the building. So really the the one thing that people do get confused about is Building 7. There was a fire and it collapsed. Why was that? And there's two main reasons, really. One is that the fire wasn't fought, and there wasn't water, and the sprinklers weren't operating. So basically, this fire was just able to run unchecked. But that's also happened in other buildings. So you look at the First Interstate Bank building in Los Angeles. That building didn't have sprinklers installed, and the firemen had a hard time getting up to the fire, and so the fire did actually burn unchecked for a while. So the difference here is in the construction of the building. There's two aspects. One is that a lot of these buildings are concrete buildings, like Greenfell wasn't steel framed, it was steel reinforced concrete, and the concrete protects the steel from the fire and provides a lot of actual support strength itself. The other thing is the size of the spans. Now, the span is a distance between columns, and the longer a span is, then the more vulnerable a building is to collapse. And World Trade Center 7 had a kind of a very unusual design because it was built over another building. There was an electric substation there, like a bunch of transformers, and they had to build this office building over the top of it. So it had all this. It was a weird shape, and it had these weird truss structures at the bottom, and then the actual layout of the columns was kind of weird as well. There's this one set of columns over one side that's really far away from any of the walls. It's the columns 79, 80, and 81, and they're all a long way from the walls. So you've got these very long spans of girders, and because they're a lot longer, when they heat up and when they expand, they will expand more than a short girder will, and so it's much more prone to pushing things off their connections. And so if you compare the actual layout of the buildings, they're very different. Greenfell, especially, is very short distances, relatively speaking, between the columns and the walls. So it's a completely different kettle of fish, really. And even the buildings that are similar, like the First Interstate Bank, are still very different in their construction, and they had a much more regular layout in which everything was at right angles rather than at strange angles. The World Trade Center 7 was this trapezoid shape, so everything was at weird angles. So they were very different buildings. So you can't really compare them. There hasn't been a building like World Trade Center 7 that has caught fire and collapsed. There has been one collapse of a moderately high-rise building, which is in Iran. Earlier this year, there was a building called the Plasco building, which collapsed due to fire. And
so it shows it can sort of be done.
It can, but now the conspiracy theorists are saying that was probably done with nanothermite too, which is a bit odd when you think about it. There's this one set of buildings done in 2001 with nanothermite, and then one obscure office building in Iran 16 years later.
Yeah, to try and stop the conspiracy theories. To throw us off, give us a little sniff still,
yeah, but now all the things you see in the World Trade Center collapses get mirrored in this thing in Plasco in Iran. You see these ejections of material as the floors get compressed, and then the fires kept burning for a few days afterward, and you see what looks like molten metal being removed from the rubble pile. So these things that look like the same evidence that was in the World Trade Center collapses appears in this Plasco collapse. So, if you're conspiratorially minded, you'll probably think that means that the entire thing was staged to make it look like the World Trade Center was a regular collapse. But the more sensible explanation is that buildings do sometimes collapse from fires, and these events like the ejections and the rapid onset and the glowing debris that comes out of the pile, these are just things that happen when a building catches fire and collapses.
Yeah, because it's so weird that you brought the molten metal up, because that was going to be sort of my next point, that it was found around the site and like down the roads, and it wasn't taken into account by the commission report, the molten metal. So what's your sort of take on that?
Well, I think when you talk about down the roads, you're probably talking about the cars.
Yeah.
Yeah, and the molten metal there is the aluminium wheels, which melt at a much lower temperature. You see it in forest fires. We've been having a lot of. I'm in California here, and there's been a lot of really bad forest fires, and you see this type of thing all the time there. People leave their car in the road outside their house. When they come back, the house is destroyed, and the car is burnt out, and the wheels are in little puddles. The steel of the car doesn't melt because steel has a much higher melting point than aluminium. But the wheels themselves, not all wheels are made of aluminium, but if the wheels are made of aluminium, then they melt. And that's what happened in the World Trade Center. At the World Trade Center disaster, there was a lot of cars caught fire just because there was falling, burning debris. And so that's, when you see along the streets molten metal, that's the actual molten metal that you do see. Now, the other molten metal is just eyewitness reports of molten metal. There wasn't actually any molten metal, like liquid metal, ever shown or found in the World Trade Center sites. People said they saw things, but we don't know exactly what they saw. People say, oh, I saw a river of molten steel, and they're talking about something that was a week or so after the actual collapse. Now, there's no way that molten steel could stay molten that long, especially not in the form of a river. If you think like you melt some steel and you pour it out into a pool somewhere, it starts to solidify almost straight away. It'll form a skin, almost straight away because it has such a high melting point. That means it actually cools down very fast because the hotter something is, the quicker it falls off that temperature because it's radiating heat like crazy. It's white hot, it's red hot. It's red hot because the heat is coming out in the form of radiation. It's just shining away from it. So it cools down a lot quicker if it's really hot. So molten steel starts to solidify very rapidly. So what people saw probably wasn't actually molten steel. There are a lot of other things that melt, like lead and aluminium and even glass. Yeah. They all glow red when they're in a fire and they're flowing. So if you're underground and you're in some kind of furnace burning really hard situation, like you're in a small area that's just burning really, really rapidly, you could see something that was actually looked molten. Or you could just see people look at things that are just glowing red and they say, oh, look, molten metal, just because it's red hot. Because they just use that term kind of loosely. They don't actually mean the liquid form. They talk about red hot stuff. And steel glows red in the dark at a relatively low temperature. Don't know if you ever played around with steel in a fire, like heating up a poker or something.
No.
But yeah, if you heat up a poker in a fire, it might look like it's not glowing, but then you turn the lights off and it's actually glowing red. So things can look very different depending on the actual situation.
Have you heard of Dr. Judy Wood's sort of theory on what happened with 9/11?
Yeah. I think it's...
What's your take on that with the free energy weapon? And obviously she shows like cars that have been burned, but yet people are around it and they're not bothered by any heat. Paper's still there.
Yeah, it's nonsense. This has actually come up in the forest fires over here. People are saying that the people's houses have been destroyed by directed energy weapons. And they're saying it, kind of for the same reason that the architects and engineers for 9/11 Truth have had to embrace the Plasco collapse as being an anothermite-driven collapse. Because you got the same evidence. You have a car that's burnt with the wheels melted, and then you have a tree next to it that seems like it's untouched. But that's just the way fire works. You can burn something, and something that's relatively nearby can be untouched. Like I have a wood fire in my house. I burn things every day, and it gets really, really hot in the fire, and yet the things in the room don't burn, and they're just 20 inches away. So I can have a bunch of newspaper next to my fireplace, and it doesn't burst into flame just because I have this incredibly hot fire with these glowing coals on the fire. Fire just doesn't work like that. It's not, if you light a match, it doesn't immediately ignite everything in the room on fire. So I think, and her idea about things being destroyed from space doesn't, or whatever, it doesn't really make any sense because the top of the building, if it was from space, the top of the building would block any directed energy weapon from hitting the area that needed to explode. Whatever's destroying the building is destroying it from the inside, not from the outside.
Yeah, I mean, the only sort of like there's a couple of parts that I've entertained slightly, and one of them she said about like buildings of smaller sizes showing up on the Richter scale, but yet when the towers fell, they barely even blipped on the Richter scale, and she showed the data in the graphs. And she said that must like that kind of shows that as the building went down, it was turned into ash, rather or turn into whatever you want to call it, and that's why I linked you that video of that steel beam turned into ash, and then you said, "Oh, it's just dust on it." But obviously, it didn't show up on the Richter scale when buildings that are of a smaller size have. So she was like using that to kind of back her point.
Well, it kind of depends how the building actually hits the ground. Like the World Trade Center 7, it's not as if somebody picked up the building and then dropped it on the ground, so it went bang on the ground. It just basically collapsed in a wave of rubble. So it did actually show up on seismographs. You can see the impact, and if you actually do an energy calculation of what would it take to make this, like it was like a 3.4 earthquake or something, the actual amount of energy in a 3.4 earthquake is about the same as you would expect. It's in the same ballpark. So these other buildings that she's showing with seismographs, I don't actually know where they came from. Like she could have been something with a seismograph that was a lot closer to the building, or it could have been a type of building when they collapsed it, they used explosives and then the explosives are what's showing up. Or they could have collapsed it in such a way that it fell over to one side, and then when it hit the ground, that showed up more. But yeah, the actual seismograph recordings of World Trade Center 7 do actually show an impact, and it's consistent with the actual amount of energy in the building.
It's really interesting, like just kind of going off on a tangent, but like how you look at something from sort of your side of the fence and go, well, she's saying it's a conspiracy, let's have a look at all the data that she's showing and where she's getting it from. And then sort of my side of the fence where I'm like,
Yeah,
she's showing me alternative information, maybe it's true. And I think that's how sometimes people can get sucked into that rabbit hole of this person's qualified, they're not going to maybe lie about the graphs or just slightly manipulate it. So, and then I don't try and debunk Dr. Judy Wood because I'm just kind of taking what she's saying as the truth because she's far more qualified than me when she might be spouting shit, basically.
Yeah, well, I mean, you probably would have a similar argument about the things that architects and engineers for 9/11 Truth say, because they're a bunch of architects and engineers, then what they say is probably correct, and so you might give what they say a lot of weight. But they say that Judy Woods is full of shit. So, which expert are you going to pick?
Yeah. I mean, obviously, there was like 1,700 plus architects and engineers that are part of this sort of 9/11 truth movement. I think it's growing, sort of.
Yeah.
Monthly.
Well, there's about 3 million that are not.
Yeah.
So, the fact that you can find a very small percentage of any profession to support, some weird theory within that profession doesn't really mean very much. People, it's a shame that we don't have some kind of architects and engineers for 9/11 reality. But when you approach architects and engineers, they just think it's ridiculous.
Yeah.
Which I think, sounds very disappointing if you're actually a truther, because, from your perspective, like you think it's all very reasonable and you think that you've got science on your side. And then you talk to someone like an engineer who actually, knows the physics behind it. And then they just think it's a bunch of bullshit. And I think that can be very off-putting for people. And so then you start to think, well, why is the engineer saying this? They must have got to him, or he must be worried about losing his job. When really he just thinks it's ridiculous, to be honest.
He's not entertaining it. Yeah, well, to obviously back up sort of that sort of statement, you said, you know, there's 3 million roughly that don't believe in the truth movement, so to an extent, or don't speak out about the truth movement.
Yeah.
So to an extent, they're probably the reality guys. So yeah.
Probably, but obviously there's an argument that they just say they're worried about losing their jobs,
Yeah, they're
which
part
doesn't
of
really make any sense
they're
because
part of the conspiracy.
yeah, there's lots of them are retired. There's lots of them don't have families, and they're not members of Architects and Engineers for 9/11 Truth because they still think it's ridiculous. And really, there aren't very many people in AE 9/11 who are really qualified, if any. There aren't people who design skyscrapers with actual analysis of how the skyscraper would actually collapse if a certain thing happened. Nobody in Architects and Engineers for 9/11 Truth has that expertise. And the people that do have that expertise all think that the controlled demolition theory is just ridiculous.
So what's your take on the engineer that built the tower? Obviously, he said that the towers were built to sort of withstand multiple jetliners.
Mm-hmm.
They took that into account when building it, and then they also took into account the biggest jetliner at the time. I can't remember what it was, and they loaded it with
757, I think.
Yeah, they loaded it with loads of gear to make it heavier. Like, so they accounted for planes maybe being a bit bigger later on. So they built it to withstand sort of that plane and maybe a bit larger. And they've obviously people, even the guy that built it, has said there's no way that planes could have caused the tower to fall the way it did.
Yeah, well, you got to remember when the towers were built, when they were designed, was in the 1960s, which was before computers as we know them. So they didn't really have the benefit of the computer modeling that we have now. So they had to do a lot of these calculations essentially by hand. Like they would draw these big diagrams, and then they would put these little arrows and numbers on them, and they would run through it. They had some computers, but a lot of this stuff was done by hand still. So when they say they checked to see if a plane could hit the building, they were just doing basically back of the envelope calculations. They thought, they were reasonable calculations. They weren't unreasonable. They thought, if the plane hits the building, it would probably take out so many exterior columns, and it will probably take out, 1 or 2 interior columns. But the building is designed in such a way that the load will be redistributed, and the building would not collapse. And that's exactly what happened. The planes hit the buildings, and the buildings barely moved. Pretty much nothing happened when they hit the building. Like, it swayed a few inches from one side to the other, which you couldn't even see visually, and then it probably changed shape imperceptibly. But what happened was the exterior columns were cut. Some core columns were possibly cut, but there was so much redundancy within the building that the loads that were carried by those columns were basically now carried by other columns because everything was tied together. And so the building did withstand the impact of the planes. And if other planes had hit the buildings in different positions, they probably would have remained standing for 1 or 2 more hits.
So obviously going down the different route with the commission report, 6 out of 10 commissioners believe that the commission report was set up to fail. What's your sort of take on that bit of knowledge there? That they listed the names on where the question came from, but I didn't bother taking the names down.
I think what that meant was they weren't going to put anybody in jail for it. Really, there were probably instances in the response to 9/11 and in events leading up to it. So they weren't able to point fingers and say this person is to blame for, the slow response of the fighters, or this person was to blame for all the firemen dying because they were sent into the building when they shouldn't have been sent in. So they weren't able to give an entirely honest account of the events of the day because people didn't want to be pointing fingers at people. They didn't want to say, the fire chief should be sacked because so many people died on his watch. I think it's things like that. And also obviously the 9/11 Commission looked into the much deeper background, like who was responsible for it, who financed it, and how did it actually happen. And I think there may well have been things like warnings that were not acted upon, both by at the highest level by the president. The president had been warned that bin Laden was going to attack, but also the intelligence services had some tabs on these guys who had come into the country and some suspicions about them, but they didn't catch them. And in some cases, they basically could have stopped the attacks had they done something better. And I think that's the type of thing that the commission report might have been hobbled over somewhat. They weren't allowed to look into that thing so much because the powers that be didn't want to point fingers and blame people.
Yeah, I mean, obviously it was underfunded as well.
Yeah, I don't know if it was underfunded. I'm not sure if they actually were lacking in funds. I think people think it's underfunded because it seems like a small amount of money. But this is essentially just the money for writing the report.
Yeah.
The actual investigation was done by the FBI. And the FBI at one point had over half of their agents working just on, they call it the Pentabomb investigation. And so the budget of the FBI is in the billions of dollars. And half of that went to the investigating the 9/11. So the fact that the commission itself only had like whatever it was, $10 million, doesn't really speak to the actual cost of the investigation, which was, essentially in the billions of dollars.
We're coming up to the hour mark. Are you able to overrun, or do you need to go? Because I was thinking Pentagon talk and a couple of other bits.
Yeah, I could do like another 10, 15 minutes.
Yeah, that's cool. So where were we? We just discussed the commission report. Cool.
Yeah.
So yeah, like the Pentagon, what's your take on that? Because obviously you had that guy come out and say $2.3 trillion couldn't be accounted for, and then apparently that part of the building was struck where they kept the papers. From the conspiracy mind, I don't know 100% whether it was, and also the footage of like the plane hitting. There's never been, to my knowledge, videos released of the actual plane going in.
Well, I think a plane hit the building, and I think the reason you can tell that is just basically looking at the damage that was done to the building. People often point to the size of the impact hole. Now, what they're often pointing to, there's two things that they point to which are misleading. One of them is a hole on the inside of the building, where one of the landing gear or something came out on the other side, basically on the interior ring. Some people point to that and say, oh, look at how small this hole is. That's kind of an obscure thing. Most people, when they point to the hole and say it's too small, they're actually pointing to the hole on the second floor. There's the ground floor and then the second floor. And the ground floor hole is actually a lot wider than that, but you can't see it because of the smoke. You can actually see bits of it in individual photographs, and you can take those individual photographs and you can take that bit of this, that bit of that, and you can look at where the columns are, and you can see it is actually wide enough to encompass the width of the plane up to and including the engines. And the actual hole that people point to as being too small is the hole that was made by the tail of the plane, the vertical stabilizer at the back of the plane. Took out like a relatively small hole in the middle. But underneath that, there's the hole made by the wings of the plane. Then what happens is, there's a big fire, they're fighting the fire, and then part of the building collapses, which kind of covers up the hole on the outside. You can't see exactly what happened. But you can still see on either side of that area where the wings hit the exterior columns. And there's these very clear damage areas on these exterior columns where this concrete has been smashed off and the rebar has been exposed, and it's all in a line. The plane was slightly tilted to the left when it hit the building, and you can see it all the way from one end to the other. And then when you look inside the building, which you can only do by reading the actual the various reports, you can see the patterns of where it hit individual columns as it proceeded through the building. That obviously it broke up almost immediately when it hit the building, but the parts of the plane kept going if they didn't hit something, and then they hit other things like other columns, and you see columns being destroyed or columns with damage area, and it's all entirely consistent with the plane hitting the building.
Why was there, like, the only thing, like, a lot of conspiracy theorists would say, myself even included on that, is like, if a plane hit, just show the footage. Do you know what I mean? It's like, why did they confiscate all this footage? And
they
I understand. I mean, I think
they
it was
didn't
like
confiscate
84.
it exactly. Yeah, there was 84, I think, or whatever it was, like a large number of tapes of security footage. But basically, they took all these tapes, they reviewed them all, and they found that none of them showed the impact. Now, people say, oh, there's so many cameras, why wouldn't it show the impact? I mean, the reason is that the majority of video cameras don't point up in the sky. They point down at the ground. If you think of like security footage, you think of it as like a camera above somebody's door looking at the entranceway. The security cameras at the Pentagon are not like scanning the skies for incoming planes. They're looking to see if someone's walking over the lawn, or looking to see if someone's going in a particular door or not. So it's not that surprising that there's no real footage of the planes hitting. There's two pieces of footage which you've probably seen. There's the one, there's a gate, not a toll gate, but a parking area gate, and that's kind of like a very low, well, it's relatively low frame rate, so you just see bam bam, then the explosion. Yeah. But if you analyze that video, you can actually make out the plane and the smoke coming from one of the engines of the plane, because one of the engines actually hit one of the light poles on the way in and damaged the engine, so it immediately started spewing smoke out, which sounds amazing, but jet engines are going very, very fast, so the instant something goes in, it comes out the other end. But you can actually see that smoke, and you can see the vague outline of the plane. It's obviously not very clear at all. But it's entirely consistent with everything else. It all matches. And then there's some other video from on the other side of the freeway, the motorway. There's from a gas station over there, and I think you can barely make out like a couple of pixels or so of the plane on the other side. But you look at that footage. Security camera footage is pretty crap back in 2001.
It's still crap
it's all
now.
recording. It's a lot better now, because everyone's getting these HD cameras recording to. But still, like people get cheap cameras and they're recording to VHS to video.
The reason why I say it's crap is because we had something called, it's just been cancelled off TV, but Crime Watch in the UK. It was like a show that had been going for forever. And
I remember it.
Even like a couple of years ago, they'd like released footage of a burglary or something, and cameras down the street, and it was always just some grainy faced thing, and I'd be like, the technology nowadays, and we still can't fucking identify criminals.
Yeah, that's the thing though. If they had the good cameras, then it wouldn't be on TV, because they would have caught the guy.
Yeah.
So you're only going to see the crap footage.
Very true.
Yeah, but like back then, 2001, the security cameras in buildings around, they were pointing down. They weren't pointing at the Pentagon. Security cameras at the Pentagon were also pointing down, because they were pointing at doorways and approaches, ground approaches. They weren't pointing at the sky. So they took all this footage. They didn't confiscate it exactly. They just took it and they looked at it and they said, like, well, nothing shows anything, except for this one thing that shows some smoke. And then they didn't proceed any more with that. Now, people like say, oh, they should release that footage, but that's footage that belongs to like the gas stations or whatever, and it doesn't show anything. So it's like, since it doesn't actually show the impact, there isn't actually a case for it being released. But it's a little bit of a quandary though, because like if they don't release it, it makes people suspicious. But they can't release it because it doesn't show anything. But if they did release it, people wouldn't be suspicious.
We'll just fly on over to Flight 93. Hopefully you saw what I did there.
Real quickly, let me just go over that. $2.3 trillion was reported missing the day before 9/11 by Donald Rumsfeld, the Secretary of Defense at the time. Except it wasn't actually reported missing he said there's 2.3 trillion dollars in transactions that we can't account for. What that meant was that the accounting wasn't up to code. They have a certain level of accounting that they need to do where they record everything and like justify everything. And the Pentagon had all these different computer systems that they use for accounting. So when one department bought something from another department to move money around, then the accounting systems weren't compatible. And what he was talking about, if you actually listen to the entire speech that he gives, is it wanting to upgrade the accounting systems of the Pentagon. And he said $2.3 trillion in transactions cannot be accounted for. Doesn't actually mean that money is missing. And if you look at that in context, the entire budget for the entire U.S. military of that year was $0.6 trillion. So you're talking about something that's 4 times the amount of the entire U.S. military budget, and that can't just simply go missing. And it didn't go missing. It was just a very large number of transactions that weren't properly accounted for, and they couldn't actually do their accounts and have them certified by account auditors. It's like if you wrote down every single financial transaction you do in a year. Like if you write down like the money you get in, then you write down when you put it into the bank, you write that down. Then when you take it out of the bank, you write that down. When you take out a loan, you write that down. When you pay back the loan, you write that down. When you use that money from the loan to buy something, you write that down. When you move it from one account to another, you write it down. If you buy something and then you sell it, you write that down. It doesn't mean, the amount of things that you write down, if you add up all those totals, it's going to be way more than the actual amount of money you spend in a year. And what he's saying is they didn't write it down in enough detail. He's not saying the money's missing. He's just saying they didn't write down enough detail exactly what was going on. And it covers the same money multiple times, because it's things like moving from one account to another, or opening up lines of credit, or like agreements between departments. So the money was never missing. So as a theory, that doesn't work. The problem is, it's kind of a difficult concept to get across to people. Because when he says things like $2.3 trillion cannot be accounted for, it sounds like $2.3 trillion is missing.
Yeah. But
it's not. I was trying to explain it to you there in simple terms, but it's difficult to get across to people. And so it's a very, very persistent conspiracy theory that there was actually something to it. But, it was bigger than the entire United States budget. Not just the military budget, the entire in the United States budget. I think it was almost like the entire gross domestic product of the United States for that year. It was an insane amount of money.
Yeah, I mean, another thing that I just must have, can't even get my words out. Another thing that has sort of been taken out of context, I guess, to sort of suit this conspiracy theory and pull people into then following the YouTube trail, which is where a lot of people seem to source their information from. The Flight 93 thing I was just going to mention, I'll make it the last point because I know you've got to shoot off, was about the phone calls being made. And a Canadian guy did a test, and he took a small plane up, and basically when he got to the altitude of 30,000 feet, there was a 0.0006% chance of making a phone call. So basically they determined it impossible. And then obviously you've got the guy that phoned his mum and was like, "Hey mum, it's John Smith," or whatever, when you wouldn't really phone your mum saying that. But obviously when adrenaline's rushing and you're in panic, you can maybe do things like that. But
I think about with him, he was a businessman, and that's the way he announced himself when he made a business call, and he just basically made calls all the time, and he was very stressed out. And his mum appeared on TV. Like there was a thing called Conspiracy Road Trip, which was a BBC show. And they did a 9/11 thing, and they took some 9/11 people, and they interviewed. Well, they didn't interview, but they went and met a whole bunch of people, and one of them was that guy's mother, and they brought up that very point, and she explained that he would say things like that, and she knew it was him. So obviously, like you could say she was in on the act, but after they talked to her, even the hardcore conspiracy theorists thought that it was actually him making that call. Although some of them thought he was making it from like a secret hangar somewhere under the desert, but the cell phones most of the calls were made from cell phones. I think all but 2 of the calls were made from the seatback phones, the air phones, which you don't have in planes anymore, but they used to have these phones in the backs of seats, which you could use with a credit card for like $20 a minute or something, and they worked just fine from 30,000 feet, and that's where all the calls were made from. And in fact, if you go into detail, you can look at the call logs, and they say which phone it was from and which seat it was. There were a couple of calls made from cell phones, but they were like right at towards the end of the flight when the planes were at much lower altitude. Obviously, they were flying over the city at some point, and people made some calls just before they hit.
Yeah, well, that makes sense. Like looking at it that way, with marginal, only minimal cell phone calls, whereas obviously a lot of people in the conspiracy theory world believe that everyone was phoning off their cell phones from that distance or whatever. But I massively appreciate you coming on. Do you want to advertise your book quick that you're planning on releasing?
Yeah, I'm writing a book called Escaping the Rabbit Hole. You can find it on Amazon for pre-order, but it's not coming out till next September because I've still got to finish writing it. And it's basically about how people get sucked into the rabbit hole of conspiracy theories, which is partly what you were talking about earlier with people like watching too many YouTube videos is getting to be like the main way people get into conspiracies now. They get sucked down a rabbit hole of YouTube videos. And it's also about escaping the rabbit hole, about how you get out of it once you get in. People have different routes out of it. I forget which pronunciation is American and which one isn't there. But yeah, people have different ways out of it, and some of them get out of it by looking at debunking videos. But most of it's people kind of find something that they thought was right, and they find out that they've been looking at it all wrong. They might find that the Pentagon hole is actually a lot bigger than they thought it was, and then that starts them on a road out of the rabbit hole. So that's what I'm writing about.
No, cool. Massively appreciate you coming on. Can I talk to you off camera? Is that okay for a quick
Sure.
recap?
Yep. Yeah.
All right, cool. Well, we're in this here. Cheers for coming on, dude.